An Army aircraft is circling above the Bismarck Sea on January 10th, 1943. The pilot has no bombs left. He has nothing to fire. He can only watch. Below him, a United States submarine is attacking a Japanese convoy. 5 freighters, 3 destroyers. The submarine is 381 feet long. She is the largest non-nuclear submarine ever built by the United States. Her name is Argonaut. She hits at least 1 destroyer with a torpedo. The destroyers counterattack. Depth charges go down. The pilot watches from above. The bow of the Argonaut breaks the surface at a strange angle. She has been badly damaged. She cannot dive. The 3 destroyers circle her. They pump shells into her bow from point-blank range. The bow sinks. The stern rises. She goes under. 102 officers and men gone. The pilot can do nothing. He circles until she disappears. Then he turns for home. The Argonaut was the only specialized mine-laying submarine ever built by the United States Navy. She was designed for a campaign that could have strangled Japan years before the war ended. That campaign was delayed, argued over, and ultimately executed by other means in 1945. In 5 months, the mining campaign finally launched in 1945, sank more Japanese tonnage than years of conventional submarine warfare had achieved. The question that the history of the Argonaut leaves open is simple. What if they had done it sooner? The United States Navy had been thinking about a Pacific War with Japan for decades before Pearl Harbor. The strategic problem was straightforward and brutal. Japan was an island empire. It imported everything essential to its economy and its military. Raw materials from the East Indies, oil from the Dutch colonies, food from the mainland and from Korea, coal, iron ore. Everything moved by ship. A nation that imports everything is a nation whose shipping lanes are its lifeblood. Cut the shipping lanes and you cut the nation. This was not a radical idea. The Royal Navy had used blockade as a strategic instrument for centuries. The concept of choking an island nation through its sea routes was established doctrine. The question was how to do it in the Western Pacific, thousands of miles from American bases, against a Japanese fleet that controlled the surface of those waters. The answer that emerged in the 1920s was the submarine mine layer. A submarine that could penetrate Japanese-controlled waters invisibly, lay a field of mines in a critical strait or harbor approach, and withdraw before anyone knew it had been there. The mines would wait. They would not announce themselves. They would simply be there, in the water, in the dark, below the surface where no minesweeper could easily find them. The first ship to trigger one would announce that the field existed. But by then the damage would be done. The submarine that embodied this concept was laid down at the Portsmouth Navy Yard on the 1st of May, 1925. She was designated V4. She was later renamed Argonaut. She was enormous, 381 feet long, a displacement of 4,450 tons when submerged. She carried 4 torpedo tubes forward and 2 mine-laying tubes aft. She could carry 60 mines in her stern mine-laying system and additional torpedoes forward. She was also the largest submarine ever built by the United States at the time of her construction. She remained the largest until the nuclear age. She was not, it must be said, a perfect submarine. Her engines were unreliable. She was slow to dive and slow to maneuver. When submerged, she was clumsy and presented a large target to sonar. The Navy knew all of this, but the minelaying mission she was built for did not require speed or maneuverability. It required range, endurance, and the ability to carry mines into waters where no surface ship could safely go. In that narrow purpose, she was exactly what had been designed. The mine-laying plans that existed on paper in the years before Pearl Harbor were detailed and ambitious. Naval planners had identified the choke points of Japanese shipping, the Shimonoseki Strait, separating the main islands of Honshu and Kyushu, the approaches to Kobe, Osaka, and Nagoya, the western ports that received oil from the Dutch East Indies, the Korean straits through which coal and iron ore moved from the continent. Mine these passages, mine them repeatedly. Keep them mined faster than the Japanese could sweep them. The analysis showed that the economic impact on Japan would be severe. The analysis was correct. It would be confirmed in 1945 when someone finally executed the plan. But in the years between Pearl Harbor and 1945, something kept getting in the way. Command disagreements over doctrine. Competition between submarine commanders who wanted to sink ships with torpedoes and naval strategists who wanted to close ports with mines. The argument that mines were passive weapons and submarines should be aggressive. The argument that the Argonaut was too slow and too large for the kind of fleet operations that Pacific Command was prioritizing. And so the Argonaut was converted. Her mine-laying gear was stripped out. External torpedo tubes were bolted to her stern. She was redesignated as a transport submarine. The only specialized mine-laying submarine the United States Navy ever built would spend her wartime service transporting Marine raiders to conduct raids on Japanese-held islands. The Makin Island raid of August 1942 is perhaps the best-known mission in the Argonaut's wartime service. The Argonaut and her sister ship, Nautilus, transported 2 companies of Marine raiders to Makin Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. The raiders went ashore, disrupted the Japanese garrison, and withdrew. The mission was uncomfortable for the Marine passengers. The Argonaut's interior, designed for the specialized equipment of mine-laying, was not built for human transport. The crossing was long. Many of the Marines were seasick, but the raid itself achieved its objectives. The Marines fought well, damaged Japanese installations, and returned to the submarines. The Argonaut and Nautilus brought most of them home. Lieutenant Richard O'Kane, who had served as a junior officer aboard Argonaut before the war and would become the most decorated submarine commander of the conflict, had already moved on to other assignments. But the experience of the Makin raid demonstrated what the large submarines of the V-class could do when their mission matched their capabilities. Transport, insertion, special operations. These were not the missions she had been built for. But they were missions she could perform. The final patrol of the Argonaut began in Brisbane, Australia, in December of 1942. Her commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander John R. Pierce. She departed for the area between New Britain and Bougainville Island, a stretch of water dominated by Japanese forces operating from the massive base at Rabaul. On January 2nd, 1943, the Argonaut sank the Japanese gunboat Ebon Maru in the Bismarck Sea. It was a success, but the Argonaut was not built for fleet combat. Her previous captain had called her ancient and clumsy. That description was accurate. She was too slow, too large, and too poorly maneuvered to function as a fleet attack submarine against escorted convoys. On January 9th, American intelligence identified a Japanese convoy, 5 transport ships. The Japanese 51st Division headed from Rabaul to reinforce the garrison at Lae on the coast of New Guinea, escorted by at least 5 destroyers. The convoy was well protected. An attack would be dangerous. Captain James Fife of Task Force 42 assigned 2 submarines to intercept, Grampus and Argonaut. The orders went out. The Argonaut acknowledged. Nothing was received from her again. What happened on January 10th, 1943, was witnessed from above. The Army aircraft happened to be in the area, its bombs already expended. Its crew could only watch. The Argonaut attacked the convoy. She fired torpedoes. She hit at least one of the escorting destroyers. The destroyers counterattacked immediately. Depth charges went down. The Argonaut was damaged severely enough that she could no longer stay submerged. She surfaced. 3 destroyers were waiting. They circled her. They fired shells into her bow at close range. The bow broke the surface at an abnormal angle. Then the stern rose. Then she went under. 102 men. The worst single loss of life of any American submarine in World War II. Her ship's bell had been donated before the final patrol to the chapel at the Pearl Harbor submarine base. It still hangs there today. The campaign that the Argonaut had been built to execute finally came in 1945, but it was not submarines that carried it out. It was B-29 Superfortress bombers. Operation Starvation began on March 27, 1945. Brigadier General John Davies assigned his entire 313th Bombardment Wing to the mission. Approximately 160 B-29 bombers operating from Tinian in the Mariana Islands. Each aircraft carried approximately 12 sea mines instead of its usual load of incendiary bombs. The target was the sea lanes of Japan. The Shimonoseki Strait was mined. The approaches to Kobe, Osaka, and Nagoya. The western ports receiving raw materials from the continent. The Korean Straits. The analysis from the 1920s had been correct. By June of 1945, traffic through the Shimonoseki Strait had fallen to 10% of its normal rate. 35 of Japan's 47 most important convoy routes were so heavily mined that they had to be abandoned entirely. Japanese commander Tadao Kuwahara told Allied investigators after the war that it had become difficult to find crews willing to sail because there was so much fear of the mines. Men were jumping ship before voyages. Japanese minesweeping expert Captain Kyuzo Tamura said, years later, that the result of the mining campaign was so effective against shipping that it eventually starved the country. In the 5 months of Operation Starvation, more than 1,250,000 tons of Japanese shipping was sunk or damaged. 670 ships, with the loss of only 15 American aircraft. For every plane lost, 45 ships had been sunk. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey called the aerial mining campaign the most economical of all types of warfare against shipping. More effective, pound for pound, than submarine attacks. More effective than carrier airstrikes. More effective than anything else the United States had tried against Japanese shipping in 4 years of war. The connection between Operation Starvation in 1945 and the USS Argonaut laid down in 1925 is not accidental. The analysis that drove the mining campaign in 1945 was the same analysis that produced the Argonaut's design 2 decades earlier. Japan imports everything. Mines close harbors without announcing themselves. A submarine can lay mines where no surface ship can go. The concept was proven. The Argonaut was built to execute it. But the strategic moment when that execution could have mattered most, in 1942 and 1943, when Japanese shipping was still moving freely through the same waters that would be mined in 1945, the Argonaut was transporting Marine raiders and ultimately assigned to intercept a convoy she was never equipped to fight. The minelaying gear had been stripped from her hull in 1942. It was never reinstalled. She was lost in January of 1943. The campaign she was designed for did not begin until March of 1945. What the history of the Argonaut produced in the long term was a re-examination of how American naval doctrine thought about mines. The post-war analyses were unambiguous. Mining had worked. It had worked faster and at lower cost than conventional attack. Japan's Prime Minister, Prince Fumimaro Konoye, said in October of 1945 that the mining campaign had been among the most significant factors in Japan's inability to continue the war. The lessons were incorporated into post-war American naval doctrine in ways that persist today. The United States Navy's mine warfare capability, the ability to lay minefields and to sweep minefields, was substantially strengthened in the years following World War II. The role of mine warfare in any future naval conflict was taken more seriously than it had been before 1942. The strategic concept that the Argonaut embodied, using submarines to penetrate defended waters and lay mines in enemy shipping lanes, influenced submarine design and doctrine in every navy for decades. Several navies built purpose-designed mine-laying submarines in the decades following World War II. The submarine mine layer, the concept that produced the Argonaut, remained a recognized capability in global naval planning. The crew of the USS Argonaut were submariners. They lived in the cramped, humid, mechanically complex world of the submarine service. They knew the risks. Every sailor who serves on a submarine understands that the vessel that protects them is also the vessel that could trap them. On January 10, 1943, they found the limit of the ship's ability to protect them. They fought. The Argonaut hit at least one destroyer with her torpedoes before the depth charges found her. She did not surface until she had to. She did not surrender. The destroyers fired until she went under. Their ship's bell still hangs in the chapel at Pearl Harbor. Their names are on the list of the Lost 52, the American submarines that did not return from patrol in World War II. The mine-laying campaign they might have conducted, launched from a ship built for exactly that purpose, fought with the doctrine that the analysis supported, was eventually conducted by other means, and proved everything that the analysis had claimed. The analysis was right. The concept was right. The ship was built. The moment when it could have mattered most was lost in the gap between doctrine and decision. That gap was closed in 1945. By then, the Argonaut had been on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea for 2 years. But the concept she embodied, and the proof that finally came in 1945, changed how the United States and every other navy in the world thought about mine warfare for the rest of the century. The weapon that waits in silence was never the same after Operation Starvation showed what it could do. 102 men, the bell in the chapel at Pearl Harbor, and a campaign executed 2 years too late that proved they were right all along. The men who designed the Argonaut in 1925 were working from a specific and carefully reasoned strategic assessment. They had studied the geography of the Pacific. They understood the distances involved. American bases were in Hawaii and on the West Coast. The Japanese home islands were thousands of miles away. Surface ships could not operate freely in Japanese-controlled waters. Aircraft of the 1920s could not reach those distances, but a submarine could. A submarine operating on the surface could cover enormous distances under diesel power. When it needed to be invisible, it submerged. When it reached its objective, it laid its mines and departed. The submarine mine layer was a weapon that could be used at a distance that no other weapon could reach in 1925. The man who built the Argonaut understood something else as well. Mines are not tactical weapons. They are strategic weapons. They accumulate. They cannot be easily swept. A field of mines laid in a critical strait does not just threaten one convoy. It threatens every convoy that tries to use that strait until the field is swept. A submarine torpedo can sink one ship. A minefield can close a harbor. The difference in scale is enormous. The Argonaut was designed to exploit that difference. She was designed to close harbors, to make the chokepoints of Japanese commerce impassable, to turn the sea routes that Japan depended on into routes that Japanese shipping would not dare use. That is exactly what Operation Starvation achieved in 1945, in 5 months. What might have happened if a coherent mine-laying strategy had been pursued from the first days of the Pacific War in 1942? using the Argonaut and the doctrine she was built to execute, is a question that naval historians have asked since the war ended. The answer depends on assumptions that cannot be verified, but the scale of what mining achieved in 5 months in 1945 compared to what conventional submarine warfare achieved in 4 years provides a context. The Japanese merchant fleet at the start of the Pacific War was substantial. Approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping. Not enough for a prolonged conflict, but enough to sustain operations if the shipping lanes remained open. As the war progressed and losses mounted, the shortage of shipping became increasingly severe. Ships could not be replaced at the rate they were being sunk. Crews became harder to find. The Japanese Navy reorganized its convoy system repeatedly in response to American submarine attacks. But mining presented a different problem. A submarine that fires a torpedo announces its presence. Depth charges can be dropped. Evasive routing can be planned. But a mine waits silently on the bottom. It does not announce itself. No evasive routing can avoid it once it is there. The only answer to a mine is to find it and sweep it. And finding a mine in a busy shipping lane before a ship hits it requires minesweeping resources that Japan was never able to deploy in adequate numbers. By the summer of 1945, the combination of submarine blockade, aerial attack, and mine warfare had reduced Japan to a state of severe resource shortage. The Japanese economy was contracting. The military could not be supplied. The civilian population was facing shortages of food and fuel. The mine campaign was a decisive component of that collapse. It came 2 years after the Argonaut went down in the Bismarck Sea. It came 2 years after the only dedicated submarine mine layer the United States ever built was lost while performing a mission she was not designed for. There is a footnote to the Argonaut story that deserves to be told. Lieutenant Richard O'Kane served aboard the Argonaut in the late 1930s. He qualified in submarines on her. He was present for the mechanical failures, the engine troubles, the condensation issues that caused electrical fires and made much of her equipment unreliable. He learned what a submarine was and what it demanded of its crew aboard a ship that was struggling against its own limitations. He left the Argonaut before the war began. He went on to command the USS Tang. In her brief combat career, the Tang sank 33 Japanese ships, more than any other American submarine of the war. O'Kane won the Medal of Honor. His time aboard the Argonaut was part of his education. The ship that was wrong for the war she was given taught him what submarines could do when they were right for their mission. That is perhaps the most lasting legacy of a ship that was designed for a campaign that was never fully used. The men who sailed her, the lessons they learned, the officers who went on from her to other commands and other victories. The bell in the chapel at Pearl Harbor rings for all of them. What the Pacific War established about mine warfare has shaped every naval conflict since. The Korean War, the mining of Haiphong Harbor during Vietnam, the Iranian mine campaign in the Persian Gulf in the 1980s, the Gulf War. In every conflict, the strategic logic that produced the Argonaut in 1925 has been rediscovered. Mines are cheap. They are difficult to sweep. They close shipping lanes without requiring a ship to be present. They impose costs on the enemy that accumulate over time. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey said it plainly after World War II. Mine warfare was the most economical form of naval attack against merchant shipping. The least cost, the most damage. That finding drove investment in mine warfare capability in the United States Navy for decades. It produced the doctrine that American submariners train on today. It produced the mine warfare assets that American naval forces maintain for potential use in any future conflict. The Argonaut was the first expression of an idea that took 2 decades to fully prove itself. She is on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. She did not survive to see the proof, but the proof came. And the concept that built her, the silent weapon that waits in the dark and closes the water against those who would sail it, is still part of how the United States Navy thinks about the sea. The pilot who watched her go under had no bombs left. He could only watch. He turned for home. The 102 men did not turn with him. But what they represented, what the ship they served on had been built to do, eventually changed the war. Just not in time for them to see it. The bell in the chapel rings on. There is another dimension to the story of the Argonaut that the historical record makes visible. In 1938, a junior officer named Richard O'Kane was completing his qualification in submarines aboard the Argonaut. She was already being described as obsolescent. Her engines troubled her constantly. The MAN diesel engines that powered her had never produced their design output. They were replaced, eventually, with General Motors engines. But the problems continued in other forms. The condensation inside the hull caused electrical fires. The dehumidifiers could not keep up. Equipment failed in the humid environment of extended patrols. O'Kane learned on a ship that demanded everything its crew could give, and often gave less than it promised in return. He took that education forward. When he commanded the Tang, he drove her hard, in the way that only an officer who understood submarine limits could drive a ship. He pressed attacks that other commanders might have declined. He trusted his crew because he had learned, aboard the Argonaut, what submarine crews were capable of. The Tang was eventually sunk by one of her own malfunctioning torpedoes that circled back on her. O'Kane survived. He was pulled from the water by a Japanese ship and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. After the war, he received the Medal of Honor from President Harry Truman. He never forgot the Argonaut. Years later, reflecting on his service, he spoke about the large and slow and difficult submarine that had started his career. He did not romanticize her. He understood her limitations, but he also understood what she had been designed to do. He had read the analysis. He knew the chokepoint strategy. He knew that the ship he had qualified on was built for a campaign that would finally be executed years after she was gone by other means. He thought it should have happened sooner. He was right. The Argonaut was commissioned on April 2nd, 1928. She was 28 years old when she went down. For most of her service life, she was a peacetime vessel. She trained. She exercised. She participated in fleet maneuvers. She carried out mine-laying exercises in the Hawaiian operating area. She was the flagship of Submarine Squadron 4 for several years. She was the largest submarine in the American fleet. She represented a doctrine, a strategy, a vision of how a Pacific War might be won without a surface battle. That vision was correct, but she never got to execute it. By the time the Pacific War began, she was already considered obsolete as a conventional submarine. Her mine-laying equipment was removed. She became a transport. She was assigned missions that suited her size and range, but not her original purpose. She died in a combat engagement that she had no realistic chance of winning, assigned to intercept a convoy with 5 destroyers, when her design had made her suitable for a mission of entirely different character. The pilot watched from above. He could not help. He reported what he saw. 102 names, 2 battle stars, a ship's bell in a chapel, and a campaign that proved, 2 years too late, that the people who built her were right. The mine does not announce itself. The harbor closes. The ship that tries to pass triggers the weapon and the field is revealed. But by then, the damage is already done. Japan's shipping lanes collapsed in 5 months in 1945 because the mines were finally there. They could have been there years earlier. The Argonaut was built to put them there. That is the story of a ship that was right, and a strategy that was delayed, and a crew that went down fighting in waters where they had no business being on the mission that was given to them. 1 bell, 102 men, and an idea that was proven correct long after the ship that embodied it was gone.